Most people think the story of giants in the Bible begins with David and Goliath, a young shepherd, a massive warrior, a single stone. It's one of the most famous moments in all of Scripture. But Goliath was not the first giant in the Bible, not even close. Long before David ever stepped onto that battlefield, the Bible had already mentioned giants. And if you read the story carefully, something strange begins to emerge. Giants appear at key moments in the biblical narrative: before the flood, in the land of Canaan, among the enemies of Israel, and every time they appear, something decisive happens next. The first mention comes in one of the most mysterious verses in the entire Bible. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days. Before the flood, before almost everything we associate with biblical history, the Bible calls them the Nephilim, and they appear at one of the darkest moments in the entire story of humanity. Who were they? Why does Scripture introduce them right before the most catastrophic judgment in human history? And why do giants appear again, centuries later, long after the flood was over? The answer starts before the flood. A strange, violent, rapidly expanding world that existed before Noah. A world the Bible describes in ways that are far more unsettling than most sermons ever mention. And the Nephilim are only the beginning. The giants don't appear out of nowhere. Genesis places them inside a specific moment in human history, a moment the early chapters build toward slowly, detail by detail. It begins right after Eden. After Adam and Eve left the garden, humanity didn't simply scatter quietly across the earth. Civilization began to take shape almost immediately. Cain built a city, livestock culture developed, musical instruments appeared. And early metalworking, bronze and iron, was already being practiced within just a few generations of the first human family. This was not a primitive world stumbling forward in ignorance. It was a world growing fast, expanding, organizing itself. And within that expanding world, two very different ways of life began to take shape. Genesis presents two distinct family lines emerging from the earliest generations of human history. The first was the line of Cain, builders of cities, developers of culture, people increasingly oriented toward human achievement and the accumulation of power. The second was the line of Seth. One quiet but significant detail marks this generation. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. These were people who still sought something beyond themselves, still reaching toward the Creator. For a time, both lines coexisted, one culture building upward, driven by ambition and progress, the other moving inward, shaped by worship and dependence on God, side by side, generation after generation. But populations were multiplying. The earth was filling with people. And as the centuries passed, the boundaries between these two ways of life began to weaken. Genesis chapter 6 opens with a striking observation. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives for themselves. Theologians have debated the precise meaning of that phrase for centuries, and that debate is worth acknowledging. But whatever interpretation one holds, the text is pointing towards something significant, a collapse of the separation that had once existed between those who sought God and those who had turned away from Him. The boundaries were gone, and the world that followed reflected it. One of the most sobering lines in all of Scripture describes what humanity had become by that point. Every imagination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil, continually, not occasionally, not in isolated pockets, continually. And it was at this exact moment, in the middle of this moral collapse, that the text introduces something unexpected. There were giants in the earth in those days. The Nephilim appear, mentioned briefly, without much explanation, in the middle of a generation that Scripture describes as the most corrupt in human history. Genesis chapter 6 is one of those passages that stops you, not because it's long, it isn't. The reference to the Nephilim takes up only a few verses, but those verses carry a weight that has fascinated and puzzled serious readers of Scripture for thousands of years. Here is what the text actually says. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And that's all the text gives. No extended description, no detailed account of their origin, no explanation of their physical characteristics beyond what is implied in the word itself. The Hebrew term behind the English word giants is Nephilim. And the passage describes these figures in layered terms. Mighty men, men of renown, powerful figures remembered from ancient times. Whatever else they were, they left an impression on the world around them. Their memory outlasted them. But here is something worth paying close attention to. The Bible gives them a single verse, and then moves on almost immediately. No mythology, no extended origin story, no lingering description, which raises a question. Why? Because if you step back and look at what Genesis chapter 6 is actually doing, the Nephilim are not the main point. They are part of a larger portrait, a portrait of a world that has reached a breaking point. The very next verse makes that unmistakably clear. The wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Read that slowly. Every imagination, only evil, continually. This is not describing a society struggling with moral failure the way every society does. This is describing something that had gone far deeper, a generation where the internal orientation of the human heart, not just its actions, but its thoughts, its instincts, its desires, had become comprehensively corrupted. A few verses later, the picture expands further. The earth was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. The word used for violence here, in Hebrew, Hamas, carries the sense of wrongful force, oppression, injustice, turned into a way of life. It wasn't simply that some people were violent. Violence had become embedded in the structure of the world, and the Nephilim exist inside that world. This is important, because the temptation when reading about these figures is to imagine them as heroic, legendary warriors from a golden age of power and strength. Ancient myths from cultures surrounding Israel sometimes described such figures that way. The biblical text resists that framing entirely. Their presence is presented as part of what had gone terribly wrong: power without righteousness, strength without wisdom, renown without God. That combination, carried to its extreme, produces exactly the kind of world the text describes. Then the narrative does something remarkable. It turns toward the Creator himself. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Grief, not merely anger, not cold judgment issued from a distance. Grief, the kind that only comes when something you love has been broken. The language here is deeply personal, and it signals that the story is about to shift. The world described in these verses, violent, corrupt, dominated by figures who had become celebrated for all the wrong reasons, is approaching a moment of reckoning. But the story doesn't end in judgment alone, because in the very next verse, something changes. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. 10 words, and they change everything. After verses of accumulating darkness, corruption spreading, violence filling the earth, divine grief pressing down on the narrative, the text pivots on a single word: but. One small conjunction carrying enormous weight. The world had gone one direction, Noah had gone another. That contrast is the hinge on which the entire story turns. Noah is described in three distinct ways. He was a righteous man, he was blameless among the people of his generation, and he walked with God. That third phrase deserves more than a passing glance. In the early chapters of Genesis, walking with God is not a casual expression. It describes something sustained, an ongoing daily orientation of life toward the Creator, a direction chosen again and again across an entire lifetime, and it had appeared before in Genesis. Just one generation earlier, another man had been described the same way. Enoch also walked with God until he was taken. In a world moving steadily away from its Creator, these two men moved toward Him. That kind of faithfulness, in that kind of environment, is not a small thing. Think about what Noah's daily life must have looked like. He was not living in isolation. He was surrounded by the same generation Scripture describes as consumed by violence and corruption. He heard what they heard. He saw what they saw. The world pressing in from every direction, its values, its appetites, its celebrations of power and dominance. And yet something in him remained oriented differently. That is the portrait the Bible offers. A man who, in the middle of a deeply broken world, maintained his relationship with God, and God responds to that. The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. The judgment that has been building is now declared plainly. The time for change has passed. The corruption has reached its fullness. What follows is a detailed command. God instructs Noah to build an ark, gopher wood, sealed inside and out with pitch, with precise dimensions, multiple decks, and a door set in its side. The instructions are not vague. They are architectural, practical. The kind of instructions given to someone who is actually going to build something. Noah would carry his family through the coming judgment, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. And representatives of the animal world would enter with them, preserved through the catastrophe that was approaching. The ark was both a vessel of salvation and a declaration to the world around it. For years, perhaps decades, Noah built, the structure rising slowly against the horizon, while the surrounding generation went on living exactly as it always had. Jesus would later reflect on this, observing that the days before the flood were marked by ordinary life, eating, drinking, marrying, right up until the moment the flood came and swept everything away. They didn't see it coming, or perhaps they saw it and simply couldn't bring themselves to believe it. Corruption, no matter how widespread, does not go unnoticed, and faithfulness, no matter how isolated it appears, does not go unseen. God preserved one family in the middle of a generation that had turned comprehensively away from Him. One man, one household, one ark taking shape while the world continued on as usual. The flood was coming, and that world, its violence, its corruption, its celebrated figures of power and renown, was about to disappear. The ark was finished. After years of obedience, cutting wood, sealing pitch, constructing something that had never existed before for an event that had never happened before, the structure stood ready, and the moment the waiting ends arrives without ceremony. God speaks to Noah one final time before the rain begins. Enter the ark, you and your household. The preparation is over. The time has come. Noah's sons and their wives enter. The animals come, pair by pair, according to the command. The ark fills with life. And then one detail carries a quiet, solemn weight. The Lord shut the door, not Noah, not one of his sons. The text is deliberate about this. God closes the ark from the outside, and in that single action, something shifts permanently. The period of warning is finished. Every opportunity to respond has passed. The door that once stood open is now sealed. Outside, the world continues for just a moment longer, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to accept what is about to happen. Then it begins. Two things happen simultaneously. The fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven are opened. Water from below, water from above. The earth itself seems to be coming undone. Rain falls continuously for 40 days and 40 nights, but the rain is only part of it. The waters rise steadily, relentlessly, covering first the low ground, then the plains, then climbing higher. At the peak of the flood, the waters covered the mountains. Everything that had been built, settled, cultivated, cities, structures, the accumulated work of generations, disappears beneath the surface. The world that the early chapters had described so carefully is gone. The line of Cain with its cities and culture, the generations of Seth, the celebrated figures of power and renown, the violence that had filled the earth. All of it covered. It is easy to read the flood as simply a dramatic story. Water rising, an ark floating, animals 2 by 2. But within the biblical narrative, what is happening here is far more significant than a natural disaster. This is the end of an entire chapter of human history. The world that had grown so corrupt that Scripture described its thoughts as only evil continually, that world ceases to exist. The generation of the Nephilim, gone. The violence that had saturated every layer of society, gone. The celebrated mighty men of renown, whose power had been built on a foundation of corruption, gone. Everything that lived on the surface of the earth was destroyed, everything except Noah and those who were with him in the ark, one family, floating above the ruins of the world that had been. And then, slowly, the waters begin to recede. Months pass, the ark drifts, and eventually it comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The door opens again. Noah steps out into a world scrubbed clean, silent, vast, and completely new. God establishes a covenant with Noah, a promise confirmed by a rainbow in the sky. The earth will not be destroyed by flood again. Life will continue. History will move forward, a new beginning. But the story of giants in the Bible does not end here, because centuries later, long after the flood, long after the covenant, long after the world had filled again with nations and peoples, the biblical narrative mentions something unexpected. Giants, again, standing in the path of Israel, and the sight of them is enough to stop an entire nation in its tracks. The world that emerged after the flood was a world starting over. Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the roots of a new human family tree. Their descendants spread across the earth, nations forming, languages diverging, peoples settling into different regions of the ancient world. Human history resumes. Civilizations begin again. For centuries, the biblical narrative shifts its focus elsewhere. The call of Abraham, the covenant with Isaac and Jacob, the descent into Egypt, the long years of slavery, the exodus under Moses. These become the great movements of the story. And then, after 400 years in Egypt, the descendants of Abraham finally approach the land God had promised them. Moses sends 12 men ahead to scout the territory. Their assignment is straightforward: enter Canaan, assess the land, report back on what they find. Most of the report is encouraging. The land is fertile, it flows with milk and honey. The fruits they bring back are large enough to require 2 men to carry them on a pole between their shoulders. But then the tone shifts. The cities are fortified. The peoples living there are powerful, and among them, in the hill country, concentrated especially around a city called Hebron, there are people the spies cannot find words adequate enough to describe. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. We saw the giants there, the sons of Anak, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Grasshoppers. That word lands hard. These were not timid men sending back an exaggerated report. They had been chosen by Moses precisely because they were capable. Yet standing in the presence of the Anakim, 10 of the 12 came back with the same conclusion: we cannot do this. The sons of Anak, descendants of a figure named Anak, associated in the biblical record with the ancient giant peoples of Canaan. They had settled in the hill country and fortified themselves there. Their presence alone was enough to fracture the confidence of an entire generation of Israelites. The fear that swept through the camp of Israel after that report was about more than size. Size was what they saw. What it represented, power, dominance, obstacles too large to overcome, was what broke them. But the Anakim were not alone in the record. Other peoples are remembered for similar characteristics. The Emim, described as great, numerous and tall, compared directly to the Anakim. The Rephaim, a name that appears multiple times across the Old Testament in connection with giant peoples east and west of the Jordan. The Zamzumim, another group described as tall and powerful, displaced from their territory before Israel's arrival. These were not isolated figures. They were peoples, communities, occupying specific regions, settled in specific territories, woven into the geography of the land Israel was being called to enter. Something worth pausing on here. Before the flood, the Nephilim appear within a world where their presence seems to be everywhere, part of a generation that had surrendered entirely to domination and violence. After the flood, the picture is different. The giant peoples appear as distinct tribes in specific locations, concentrated, contained, their influence real and intimidating, but no longer spread across the whole earth. Whatever connection these post-flood peoples had to that ancient world, the scale had changed, and they were gradually being removed from the story. During the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, many of these tribes are defeated and displaced. Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from the surrounding region. None of the Anakim remained in the land of Israel after the conquest, except in 3 places: Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, 3 Philistine cities. And that detail, easy to miss on a first reading, becomes quietly significant later in the story. Because one of those cities, Gath, would eventually produce a warrior whose name would become more famous than any other giant in the entire biblical record. But before we reach him, there is one more giant king the Bible remembers, a ruler whose territory stretched across dozens of fortified cities, whose iron bed became a monument to his reputation, and whose defeat became one of the defining moments in Israel's journey toward the Promised Land. Before Israel ever crossed the Jordan River, they had already fought. The wilderness journey that followed the Exodus was not simply a long walk through empty desert. It was a series of encounters with hostile peoples, with difficult terrain, with their own doubts and failures. And as they moved through the territories east of the Jordan, they came up against kingdoms that would not let them pass peacefully. One of those kingdoms belonged to a man named Og. Og was the king of Bashan, a region stretching northeast of the Sea of Galilee. The land was known for its fertility, rich pastures, dense forests, productive soil. But it was also a land of fortified cities, heavily walled, well defended. The kind of territory that announces its ruler's power before you ever meet him. And Og himself was a figure the biblical record treats with particular attention. There is a detail the text seems to preserve deliberately, almost as a kind of historical footnote. Og's bed, his iron bed, was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. By standard ancient measurements, that places its length somewhere around 13 feet. The text notes that this bed could still be found in Rabbah, a city of the Ammonites, as though it had become a landmark, a relic, something people pointed to and remembered. Beds don't get recorded in scripture without a reason. This one was recorded because it told you something about the man who slept in it. The same passage identifies Og as one of the last of the Rephaim. That connection is significant. The Rephaim were among the giant peoples mentioned throughout the Old Testament, the same tradition that included the Anakim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. Og was a living remnant of the ancient giant peoples who had once occupied the whole region, and his kingdom reflected his stature. The territory of Og makes the scale of the confrontation clear. 60 cities, fortified cities, protected by high walls, gates, and iron bars. The kind of urban infrastructure that takes generations to build and maintain. Og had not simply inherited a patch of land. He had ruled a well-established, heavily defended kingdom for long enough to leave his mark across an entire region. For the Israelites approaching from the wilderness, this was not an abstract challenge. These were people who had spent 400 years as slaves, who had wandered for decades through desert, who were still forming their identity as a nation, still learning what it meant to operate as a free people under God. And now they were being asked to confront a king whose bed was 13 feet long and whose territory included 60 fortified cities. Then God speaks. Before the battle begins, before a single weapon is drawn, do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand. Do not fear him, not, he is smaller than he looks, not, your army is stronger than you think. Simply, do not fear him. Because the outcome of this encounter does not rest on the balance of military power. It rests on something else entirely. By the time Israel stepped forward, the outcome was no longer undecided. They were walking into something God had already declared finished. Israel goes to battle, and Og falls. His kingdom, all 60 cities, all that fortified territory northeast of the Jordan, passes into the hands of the tribes of Israel. The land is distributed, the cities are settled, and the man whose iron bed had become a monument to his reputation disappears from the story. His defeat marked something more gradual but unmistakable, the slow recession of the ancient giant peoples from the land. One by one, the kingdoms associated with these figures were being removed. Og was among the last, and after him, the biblical record grows quieter on the subject, almost quiet. In those 3 Philistine cities, Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, something remained, and from one of them, a warrior would eventually emerge whose challenge would ring out across the hills of Judah. A challenge that no one in the army of Israel was willing to answer, until a shepherd boy arrived at the battlefield carrying nothing but a sling and 5 smooth stones. By the time of King Saul, Israel had been a nation in the land for generations. The conquest under Joshua was history. The era of the judges had come and gone. A monarchy had been established, and yet the conflicts that had always surrounded Israel continued, particularly with the Philistines, a people who occupied the coastal regions to the west and who repeatedly pressed into Israelite territory. Among their cities was Gath, the same Gath where Anakim had remained after the conquest. That detail, passed over so quickly in the record, now comes forward. Because from Gath came a warrior who would make every giant mentioned before him seem like prologue. His name was Goliath. 1 Samuel, chapter 17, introduces him with the kind of deliberate, almost ceremonial detail the biblical writers reserve for figures who are meant to be taken seriously. Goliath was a champion. The word implies a man who steps forward on behalf of his army, whose personal victory settles the outcome for everyone. He came out from the Philistine camp fully prepared for exactly that role. His height is given as 6 cubits and a span, depending on the cubit measurement used, somewhere between 9 and 10 feet tall. And the armor described in the verses that follow leaves no ambiguity about the kind of warrior he was. A bronze helmet, a coat of scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze greaves protecting his legs, a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders, and a spear with an iron point weighing 600 shekels. The description is methodical, almost inventory-like, as though the text wants you to understand, piece by piece, exactly what Israel was looking at across that valley. For 40 days Goliath came forward, morning and evening, the same challenge. "I defy the armies of Israel this day." The same words, the same posture, the same silence from the other side of the valley. Saul was there, his army was there, experienced soldiers who had fought before, men who understood what warfare cost, and for 40 days, not one of them moved. Fear does that. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply holds you in place, day after day, while the thing you're afraid of keeps showing up at the same time every morning. Then David arrives. He is not there as a soldier. He has come from Bethlehem to bring food to his brothers, basic provisions from their father Jesse. He is young. He is not in armor. He has no military rank. And when he hears Goliath's challenge carrying across the valley, his reaction is completely different from everyone else's. Not paralysis, not calculation, something closer to offense. He cannot understand why no one has responded. The way David sees it, Goliath is standing against the God of Israel, and that, not the size of the giant, not the weight of his armor, is what David cannot leave unanswered. "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." There it is, the center of the entire story, a name. The name of the Lord of hosts, the God who commands armies, who governs history, who does not yield to iron spear points or bronze helmets, or 40 consecutive days of unanswered challenges. David runs toward Goliath, a sling, a stone, one motion, and the giant falls. The Philistine army scatters. Israel pursues them. And the man whose armor alone weighed more than most soldiers carried into battle lies face down in the valley of Elah. In the conflicts that follow later in David's reign, the biblical record mentions other Philistine warriors associated with Gath, figures described in ways that run parallel to the giant traditions of Canaan, and after them, the subject fades. The giant peoples who had appeared across so many chapters of Israel's history, the Anakim, the Rephaim, Og of Bashan, Goliath of Gath, gradually disappear from the story entirely. Their presence is finished. But the questions they leave behind are not. We have traveled a long distance through scripture in this video, from the strange, violent world described in Genesis chapter 6, where the Nephilim appeared at the peak of humanity's moral collapse, to the wilderness east of the Jordan, where an old king named Og ruled 60 fortified cities and was identified as one of the last of the Rephaim. From the hill country of Canaan, where 12 spies returned pale and shaken after encountering the sons of Anak, to a valley in Judah where a shepherd boy stepped forward and ended a 40-day standoff with a single stone. These are not disconnected stories. They form a thread, and that thread runs through one of the Bible's most consistent and quietly insistent themes. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 introduces the Nephilim inside a world defined by human pride carried to its furthest extreme. Power celebrated, violence normalized, the boundaries between strength and righteousness completely dissolved. The Anakim and the Rephaim appear as the obstacles standing between Israel and the land God had promised them, intimidating enough to fracture the faith of an entire generation. Og of Bashan rules from behind 60 fortified walls, his iron bed a monument to a reputation built over decades. And Goliath stands in the valley of Elah, unchallenged for 40 days, the full weight of Philistine military confidence embodied in a single man. In every case, the giants represent the same thing, human power at its most overwhelming. strength in its most visible, most intimidating form. The kind of force that looks at the people of God and says, "You cannot pass, you cannot win, you are grasshoppers," and in every case, that power fails. The flood came, and the world of the Nephilim vanished beneath the water. Joshua moved through the hill country, and the Anakim were driven out. Israel crossed the Jordan, and Og's 60 cities became their inheritance. David ran toward Goliath, and the giant fell before he ever reached him. The pattern is too consistent to miss. The greatest obstacles in human history have never been larger than the purposes of God. That is not a motivational phrase. It is what the biblical record actually shows, story after story, generation after generation. The things that looked permanently immovable, they moved. The rulers who seemed untouchable, they fell. The challenges that made an entire nation feel like grasshoppers, they were overcome. The victories in these stories never belonged to the people who trusted their own strength. They belonged to those who trusted God. Noah did not survive the flood because he was the most capable man of his generation. He survived because he walked with God in a world that had stopped walking with him. The conquest of the hill country was the same story told differently. An army that had every reason to retreat, moving forward, because God had declared it would. And David did not defeat Goliath because he had better aim than the trained soldiers standing behind him. He stepped forward because he understood something the rest of the army had forgotten, that the battle ultimately belongs to the Lord. The giants of Scripture are preserved in the biblical record for a reason. They show us what overwhelming opposition looks like. They show us what happens when human power is celebrated apart from God. And they show us again and again that none of it, not the Nephilim, not the Anakim, not Og's iron bed, not Goliath's bronze armor, none of it was enough to stop what God had set in motion. The real power in this story was never found in size or strength or fortified cities. It was found in faith, quiet, persistent, sometimes trembling faith. The kind Noah had while building an ark no one believed was necessary. The kind Caleb had when he alone among the spies said the land could be taken. The kind David had when he picked up 5 smooth stones and ran toward the thing everyone else was running from. That pattern did not end in the Old Testament. It runs straight through Scripture and lands at the feet of every person who has ever stood in a valley, staring up at something that seemed impossible to overcome. The Bible does not promise that the giants in your life will be small. It promises something far better, that you do not face them alone. If one of these stories has stayed with you, leave it in the comments. There's more in these texts than any single video can cover.